How does a fortress fall not from bombs, but from fear? On the night of September 23rd, 2025, that question became a living nightmare for millions of Russians. The skies above Moscow, once thought untouchable, turned into an inferno. It began with a low, distant hum, then a roar of engines, and within minutes, the capital of Russia was on fire. According to early reports from Reuters and DW, more than 40 Ukrainian drones streaked through the night sky, swarming toward Moscow like mechanical wasps. The explosions that followed shattered the illusion of safety that had protected the Russian capital for years. The night air was filled with a deafening mix of alarms, anti-aircraft fire, and sirens. From the Kremlin's golden domes to the outskirts of the city, people ran for cover. Windows glowed red from distant fires. Apartment blocks trembled as shockwaves rolled through the streets. Witnesses described the sound as a thunder that never stopped. For the first time since the war began, Muscovites, more than 20 million of them, were no longer spectators of a distant conflict. They were living inside it. Within minutes, Moscow's airports Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, and Vnukovo were plunged into chaos. Every incoming and outgoing flight was suspended. Hundreds of passengers waiting to take off were suddenly stranded inside terminals that had turned into shelters. Cancelled flashed endlessly across electronic boards as if announcing the end of normal life itself. Metro stations, once symbols of Soviet grandeur, became makeshift bunkers where families huddled in fear. The capital that once bragged of its modern skyline was now paralyzed, its lifelines cut off by unseen machines in the dark. Outside, the streets were jammed with traffic as panic spread. Thousands of drivers abandoned their cars running toward underground passages, while others froze behind the wheel listening to the pounding explosions above. Apartment windows flickered as people tried to film what they saw: fiery trails crossing the sky, then bursts of orange as air defense missiles detonated mid-air. For every intercepted drone, another seemed to slip through. The truth was clear: Moscow's famed security bubble had burst. What made the attack even more terrifying was its precision. According to military analysts cited by Defense News, the drones came from multiple directions, west, north, and southeast, attacking at various altitudes to overwhelm Russia's layered defenses. In less than an hour, the city's entire airspace was locked down under the Kremlin's emergency plan, known as the Cover Protocol. All takeoffs and landings were banned. Aircraft already in the air were ordered to divert. Yet this order created new danger. Passenger planes circled helplessly above, running low on fuel, searching for airports already overwhelmed. In one haunting scene captured on local telegram channels, a commercial airliner skimmed just meters above apartment roofs in a Moscow suburb, gliding like a ghost through the smoke before vanishing into the night. For the people inside, it was a moment of sheer terror. For those on the ground, it was proof that war had reached their doorstep. By dawn, Moscow's skyline was scarred with smoke. The Kremlin declared victory, claiming that all terrorist drones were destroyed. But Russians scrolling through their phones saw a different story. Videos of burning cars, shattered windows, and terrified families running through subway tunnels. The gap between what the state said and what people saw with their own eyes had never been wider. The unthinkable had happened. The capital of the world's largest country was under attack. Its air defenses breached, its citizens panicking. For years, Putin had promised that Moscow would never fall, that his fortress was unbreakable. Yet on this night, the legend of that fortress turned to ashes. If the war could reach Moscow, what city in Russia was truly safe now? The panic had just begun. When dawn broke over Moscow, the city was unrecognizable. Its glittering towers and wide boulevards stood silent beneath a sky still thick with smoke. The attack had lasted through the night, 16 relentless hours of sirens, explosions, and fear. By the morning of September 24th, 2025, the Russian capital was paralyzed. The war that had once been distant and abstract was now inside every apartment, every metro tunnel, every heart. Inside Moscow's airport, scenes of chaos unfolded like something from a disaster film. At Sheremetyevo, more than 200 flights had been cancelled in less than 40 minutes. The terminals overflowed with people, some shouting into their phones, others sitting silently on the cold floor, too stunned to move. Children lay asleep on suitcases. Elderly passengers leaned against walls, exhausted after hours of waiting. Business travelers in suits tried to call their offices, repeating the same hopeless words, "My flight is cancelled." It was not just an inconvenience, it was the collapse of order. In videos shared on Telegram and verified by BBC monitoring passengers could be heard crying as announcements blared overhead. All flights suspended. Please remain inside. Mothers tried to distract their children with cartoons on their phones. Teenagers streamed live footage of explosions flashing across the distant skyline. Outside, the runways glowed red from burning debris. Airport staff struggled to manage the panic, but the fear was uncontrollable. The chaos extended far beyond the terminals. Across the city, roads became parking lots. Some Muscovites abandoned their cars altogether, seeking refuge in metro stations. Others locked themselves inside apartments, afraid to open curtains or step onto balconies. Telegram channels filled with desperate messages. Where can we hide? Is it safe near the river? They said drones hit the south. Traffic cameras captured eerie images, intersections completely jammed, headlights frozen in endless lines. In residential districts, people stood on rooftops filming the flashes in the distance. One clip that spread rapidly online showed a passenger plane flying dangerously low over a Moscow suburb, its engines sputtering as it tried to find somewhere to land. Residents screamed as the aircraft passed just meters above their buildings. It was a moment of collective horror, proof that control had been lost. For the first time, Muscovites experienced what Ukrainians had lived with for years, the terror of the unknown. Where would the next drone hit? Which explosion was close enough to destroy the building? Even those who had supported the war could no longer pretend it was far away. It was now above their own roofs. As panic spread, the Russian Ministry of Defense issued statements claiming all enemy drones had been neutralized. Yet the night's evidence contradicted every word. The attack had forced Russia to activate its cover plan, an emergency lockdown of all airspace over the capital. Passenger aircraft from Minsk, Istanbul and Berlin were forced to divert to St. Petersburg, Kazan and Nizhny Novgorod. But within hours, those airports too reached capacity. Dozens of planes circled in holding patterns, burning fuel while crews pleaded for landing clearance. One pilot later described the scene as a storm with no harbour. Some aircraft had to refuel mid-air. Others were redirected hundreds of kilometers away. For passengers, it was a nightmare, the eerie glow of Moscow burning below the sound of engines, straining the uncertainty of where they would land. By sunrise, fuel levels on several jets had reached critical lows. Air traffic controllers scrambled to find safe runways, while emergency services braced for the worst. Although no major crashes were reported, the risk had been terrifyingly real. "We were minutes away from disaster," said one aviation expert interviewed by DW. Down on the ground, the psychological shock was immediate and profound. In cafes, people whispered that it felt like the collapse of the Soviet Union all over again, a moment when everything once considered stable suddenly fell apart. Others compared it to the early days of the pandemic when uncertainty ruled every hour. But this time it was not a virus. It was war. And perhaps most revealing of all was the silence that followed. The Kremlin-controlled television networks played patriotic music and repeated official reassurances. But Muscovites no longer believed what they heard. They believed what they had seen: the streaks of fire, the sounds of explosions, the fear in their children's eyes. That night, something deeper than airspace had been violated. The sense of invulnerability, the core of Moscow's identity, was gone. The question now echoing across the city was simple and chilling. If Moscow can burn what is left to protect. The Kremlin had long proclaimed Moscow to be the best defended city on Earth. It was on paper the crown jewel of Russian military engineering, a fortress wrapped in concentric rings of steel and radar. Yet in the early hours of September 23rd, that myth shattered. The famous Moscow shield, built over decades at a cost of billions, had failed before the eyes of 20 million people. According to Reuters and Defense News, the attack exposed a brutal truth. Russia's air defense network was not designed for this kind of war. The layered system that once promised to protect the capital from bombers and ballistic missiles crumbled under the pressure of cheap disposable drones. Military experts now describe the event as a turning point, not just in technology, but in psychology. At the outermost ring of Moscow's defense stood the S-400 Triumph and the newer S-500 Prometheus systems, long-range giants capable of detecting targets hundreds of kilometers away. Their job was to destroy incoming missiles or aircraft long before they reached Russian airspace. Inside that circle was the S-300, an older but still powerful system, along with the Buk launchers. Closest to the city centre were the short-range point defence systems, the last line protecting the Kremlin, the Ministry of Defence, and the elite neighbourhoods of western Moscow. These included the Pantsir S-1, a self-propelled gun and missile system now infamous for being mounted on the roofs of government buildings. And above all these metal layers lay one invisible, one electronic warfare. Jamming devices such as Krasuka and Pol-21 were supposed to blind and deafen any unmanned aerial vehicle approaching the capital. They were meant to create a dome of electromagnetic silence, a digital curtain that nothing could pass through. But reality did not match theory. On that night, the system froze like a machine overwhelmed by too many commands. Drones appeared simultaneously from the west, north, and southeast. Some flew high, others skimmed rooftops. Their composite materials made them nearly invisible to radar. The computers that guided Moscow's defenses could not distinguish which blips were real and which were noise. Within minutes, the entire network was saturated a perfect storm of confusion. The S-400 batteries fired first. Their missiles, each worth between $2 and $3 million, sliced through the sky, detonating in brilliant flashes. Some found their targets. Others exploded aimlessly. Every shot cost more than an average Russian family's lifetime savings. As DW noted in its coverage, the economics of this exchange were devastating. For every Ukrainian drone costing perhaps $20,000 to $100,000, Russia was spending 20 to 100 times that amount just to shoot it down. It was an unsustainable equation, a war of attrition that Russia could not afford. Every night Moscow lit up the sky with million-dollar fireballs, and every night Ukraine spent a fraction of that to send more. It is not just a battle of machines, wrote Jane's Defense Weekly, it is a battle of endurance, and Ukraine has rewritten the rules. Meanwhile, geography turned against Moscow's defenders. The capital's skyline, once a symbol of modernity, became its weakness. Towering buildings, bridges, and industrial zones created radar shadows where drones could hide. The city itself acted like camouflage. Low-flying UAVs could slip through narrow alleys of interference until they were detected only seconds before impact. By the time a Pantsir S-1 battery locked on the target was already too close. Residents captured these moments on their phones, bright arcs of tracer fire streaking across the sky, followed by thunderous explosions. Sometimes the interceptor missiles missed and fell back to Earth, setting cars ablaze. Each mistake fed a new wave of fear. It was clear that the defenders were firing blind. The Kremlin's official narrative that the air defense network had performed flawlessly collapsed under the weight of citizen footage. The videos told a story that state media could not control. Moscow's sky was porous. Its guardians, once proud symbols of strength, were reduced to desperate improvisation. The deeper problem, analysts say, lies in doctrine. Russia's military thinking was forged for the 20th century, a world of heavy bombers, ballistic missiles, and nuclear deterrence. The new battlefield is smaller, smarter, faster, and cheaper. In this digital swarm, warfare size is no longer an advantage. A billion-dollar system can be overwhelmed by a cloud of plastic and silicon worth less than a car. The failure was not only technological, but philosophical. The empire that built weapons to strike from space could not stop machines the size of bicycles. As night turned to morning, Muscovites realized that their protection, the one promise Putin had always guaranteed, had vanished. The invincible shield was not a wall of steel. It was a myth made of propaganda. And once a myth collapses, it cannot be rebuilt with missiles. If the Kremlin cannot defend its own sky, what will happen when the next wave comes stronger, faster, and even closer? War is not only fought with missiles, it is fought with money, fear, and perception. And on the night of September 23rd, Ukraine managed to strike Russia on all three fronts at once. The explosions over Moscow were not simply tactical victories, they were a masterclass in economic and psychological warfare meticulously designed to break the Kremlin's confidence from within. As Reuters noted, each drone launched by Ukraine cost as little as $20,000, some built with 3D printed components and commercial GPS systems. Russia's response, however, required interceptor missiles costing millions. Every flash of light in the sky, every launch from an S-400 battery was not only a defensive move, it was a financial hemorrhage. Within a single night, the Kremlin had likely spent tens of millions of dollars to repel an assault worth less than a few $100,000. This imbalance is precisely what makes drone warfare devastating. Ukraine has turned asymmetry into an art form. A small investment of resources yields enormous strategic results, panic in the capital exhaustion of Russian munitions, and damage to the myth of technological supremacy. It's a textbook example of economic attrition, wrote analysts at Defense News, where the cheaper weapon wins by forcing the richer opponent to waste itself into bankruptcy. And beyond the financial drain came something far more dangerous fear. For decades, Muscovites had been promised safety. The Kremlin's unspoken pact with its citizens was simple. Stay out of politics and we will keep war far from your homes. That contract shattered in a single night of fire and sirens. In videos from Telegram channels, one could hear the raw panic. Mothers clutching children in underground metro corridors. Men shouting as explosions echoed outside. Young couples crying their voices, trembling with disbelief. For years, propaganda had painted Ukraine as weak, chaotic, and desperate. But now it was Moscow that trembled. The psychological reversal was complete. Even those loyal to the regime felt the shift. We were always told our air defense is the best in the world, one Muscovite told DW reporters. But if they can reach Moscow, maybe they can reach anywhere. Such words, quietly spoken, are dangerous in a country where silence is safety. Yet they reveal the new mood disbelief transforming into anger. What Ukraine achieved that night was not just destruction, it was humiliation. The Kremlin's image of invincibility cracked in front of the entire world. Russian state television tried to drown the noise with patriotic marches and slogans of victory. Yet the evidence on people's phones told another story. Burning cars, falling debris windows shattered across Moscow city, and flames reflected on the glass towers that once symbolized modern Russia. The psychological impact extended deep into the elite class, the bankers, politicians, and businessmen living in luxury compounds west of the city. When fragments of drones fell near the Rubliovka highway, the message was unmistakable. Even the most powerful are no longer safe. This was not just a military operation, it was psychological theater. Every explosion above Moscow was a statement: we can reach you. According to BBC analysis, Ukraine's strikes are no longer about immediate battlefield gain. They are designed to erode the Kremlin's political base, the comfortable urban middle class that supports Putin in exchange for peace and privilege. The attacks expose the lie at the heart of his rule that Moscow is untouchable, that Russia's wars happen only elsewhere. And while the Kremlin insists that all drones were shot down, the truth no longer matters. In modern warfare, perception is victory. Each night of explosions feeds new rumors, new doubts. Even a single missed drone that strikes an apartment block is enough to flood social media with images of fire, and those images travel faster than any missile. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to innovate. Sources close to Jane's Defense Weekly report that new drone models are being developed with longer range and higher payload capacity, capable of reaching deep into Russian territory without direct human control. This new phase of warfare is not about destruction alone. It is about creating instability, forcing Russia to defend everywhere all the time. And it is working. Russian officials now speak of fatigue in air defense crews. Fuel and ammunition costs are rising. Maintenance delays are crippling the military budget. Even the once proud Russian defense industry, already hit by sanctions, struggles to replace expended missiles fast enough. Each night of drone alarms pushes the Kremlin closer to a breaking point, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of its own citizens. The people who once believed in the myth of protection now live in constant tension, checking the sky before they sleep. The war is no longer distant. It is psychological, economic, and deeply personal. The fortress has not only cracked, it has begun to crumble from within. But what happens when fear turns into anger, and anger turns toward the Kremlin itself? For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin ruled through an unspoken contract. He did not need to promise freedom or democracy. What he offered instead was stability. Moscow would be safe. The economy would function. Ordinary Russians could live their lives untouched by war so long as they obeyed, kept quiet, and did not question authority. That was the deal. But on the night of September 23, 2025, that contract was shattered. As the explosions thundered over Moscow, millions of Russians realized a cruel truth: Putin could no longer keep his side of the bargain. The myth of the fortress Russia, carefully built through years of propaganda, had gone up in flames. According to DW and BBC News, what happened that night was not just a military failure, it was a social and psychological rupture. The images flooding social media, burning cars in the streets, families hiding underground missiles streaking across the sky, carried one clear message: even the capital is vulnerable. And for the Russian middle class, the group that had traded political freedom for personal comfort, that realization was devastating. In the days that followed, Telegram channels and local forums were flooded with disbelief. "We thought the war was somewhere else," one Muscovite wrote. "Now it's here." Others asked bitterly, "If Putin can't protect Moscow, who can?" The fear that once united Russians behind their leader was now turning inward, becoming suspicion and resentment. What made the situation even more explosive was where the drones had fallen. Wreckage was found near the Rublyovka Highway, the elite residential area where oligarchs, politicians and generals live behind high walls and private security gates. These were the people who had funded and benefited from the Kremlin's power, and now they too had to listen to sirens in the night. For the first time, the war touched the untouchables. As Reuters reported, the attack sent shockwaves through the Russian elite. Private jets were quietly moved to foreign hangars. Wealthy families began sending their children abroad again, recalling the panic of the early sanctions years. Fear spread not from the battlefield, but from luxury apartments overlooking the Moscow River. "It is no longer about Ukraine," wrote a Russian political analyst in exile. "It is about survival." For the Kremlin, this is the most dangerous kind of crisis, not an external one, but an internal one. The regime's power depends not only on its military, but on the illusion of control. If that illusion breaks, even the most loyal supporters begin to doubt. And once doubt enters the capital, it spreads like wildfire. The attack also exposed how disconnected Moscow's political elite had become from the reality of war. For months, officials assured citizens that the special operation was going according to plan, that life in the capital was normal. Yet on that night, the sirens told another story, one that no amount of propaganda could silence. "War is not supposed to reach Moscow," said a former Kremlin advisor speaking to Al Jazeera English. "That is the entire foundation of Putin's rule. The people must believe that suffering happens elsewhere, in Donbass, in Kursk, in Kharkiv. Never here." But that illusion was gone. The drone parts lying in Moscow's streets were not just debris, they were symbols of a broken promise. Even more significant is how the event changed the psychology of Russia's most privileged citizens. For years, the wealthy class had tolerated the regime's corruption and isolation, as long as their wealth and comfort remained untouched. But when explosions echoed near Moscow City, when drone fragments crashed near shopping malls and luxury towers, the boundary between them and us dissolved. Suddenly, everyone was vulnerable. Ukraine's strategy, according to Defense News, was never simply to destroy buildings. It was to break that invisible wall, separating the rulers from the ruled. Every drone over Moscow was not aimed at infrastructure, it was aimed at confidence. And confidence once shattered is almost impossible to rebuild. In the following days, state television showed Putin appearing calm, promising swift retaliation. Yet his face told another story, tight-weary, aware that something fundamental had changed. No leader can claim strength when his own citizens are running for cover. On social networks, Russians began sharing a bitter joke. "Our air defenses defend everything except us." It was more than sarcasm. It was rebellion in its quietest form, laughter in the face of fear. And so the great social contract that had sustained Putin's Russia obedience in exchange for protection disintegrated in the smoke over Moscow. The panic was not just physical, it was existential. For millions of Russians, especially in the capital, the question was no longer about Ukraine's advance or Western sanctions. It was about survival trust and the future of their country. As Reuters observed, this was not merely an attack on a city, it was an attack on the psychology of an empire. The sound of drones over Moscow echoed far beyond the skies. It echoed in the hearts of those who had once believed that war would never touch them. And now, as that illusion crumbled, a new, dangerous question began to form in living rooms across the capital. If Putin can't protect Moscow, can he protect Russia at all? By the end of that fateful week, one truth had become unavoidable. Russia's war was no longer about territory or front lines. It was about survival. And for Vladimir Putin, it had turned into a nightmare with no good choices left. Inside the Kremlin's concrete walls, military planners faced an impossible equation. Every drone strike on Moscow forced them to make the same agonizing decision: should they protect the capital or protect the front? According to Reuters and Defense News, this was not just a tactical dilemma, it was a political one that could decide the fate of Putin's rule. To shield Moscow from future attacks, the Kremlin began redeploying some of its most advanced Panzer S-1 air defense systems from the Ukrainian front. These units, with their experienced crews, were meant to defend command centers and ammunition depots near Donbass. But one by one, they were pulled back to the capital. Some were even placed on the rooftops of government buildings and skyscrapers in Moscow City. The message was clear: the fortress was closing its gates. Yet every battery removed from the front created new vulnerabilities. Ukrainian missiles and drones soon struck warehouses, radar stations, and logistic hubs that had been left exposed. For every missile that protected a Moscow tower, another hit a frontline depot. Ukraine's strategy was brutally efficient. It forced Russia to stretch its limited defenses until they snapped. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly describe this as a strategic choke. Russia can no longer defend both its symbolic capital and its active war zones simultaneously. Its air defenses are too few, its trained operators too exhausted, and its production lines too slow. The Kremlin now faces three grim scenarios, and each one ends in loss. The first is: defend the castle, sacrifice the front. In this approach, Putin thinks like a politician, not a general. He strengthens Moscow's defenses to preserve the image of control and stability. The capital must never again appear vulnerable. But the price is devastating: weakened front lines, mounting losses, and an army forced into retreat. This strategy preserves the regime's image for now, but at the cost of eventual military collapse. The second option is win the war, risk the castle. Here the generals prevail over the politicians. The best systems remain at the front, where they are needed most. Moscow's defense is managed by outdated equipment and luck. Each successful drone strike on the capital becomes a propaganda wound, proof that the Kremlin cannot protect its own heart. Politically, this could unravel the regime faster than any battlefield defeat. And then there is the third path: try to do both, fail at both. This is the choice of indecision, the path of authoritarian paralysis. It is the one Russia seems to have taken. The Kremlin shifts defenses back and forth like pieces on a chessboard, reacting instead of planning, losing soldiers in the south while losing confidence at home. The result is the worst of both worlds: a bleeding army and a frightened capital. In the words of a retired Russian officer interviewed by DW, "We have built a wall around Moscow, but it is made of fear, not steel. That fear is spreading through the military, through the bureaucracy, through the streets. Every night of alarms drains morale. Every video of falling debris chips away at the myth of power. Economically, the cost is catastrophic. Each S-400 interceptor fired over the capital burns millions of dollars that Russia cannot easily replace. Sanctions have slowed the production of new missiles and electronics. The Kremlin's finance ministry, according to Al Jazeera English, is already diverting civilian budgets to cover the military shortfall. The empire is eating itself. Politically, the damage is even deeper. Putin's aura of invincibility, the foundation of his authority, depends on control. Control over territory, over information, over fear. The drone strikes stripped all three away. Russians now know their skies are not safe. They know state television lies, and they are beginning to sense that the man in charge is no longer untouchable. Meanwhile, Ukraine has achieved something few thought possible. Without deploying a single soldier across the border, it has forced the Kremlin to fight a war inside its own borders, militarily, economically, and psychologically. Every explosion in Moscow weakens Russia's position abroad and its confidence at home. It forces Putin to make mistakes, to overextend, to reveal his fear. By late autumn, new drone waves were already being prepared. Analysts say Ukraine may soon strike industrial hubs deeper inside Russia, refineries, power stations, rail junctions. Each new attack pushes Moscow closer to the brink of panic, and yet retaliation brings no relief. The Kremlin can bomb Ukrainian cities, but it cannot bomb away its own insecurity. As one Western diplomat told BBC International, Ukraine doesn't need to conquer Moscow. It only needs Moscow to feel conquered. And in that sense, the goal has been achieved. The fortress is intact, but its people are terrified. For Putin, the path ahead is narrowing. Every decision leads to erosion of resources, of trust, of time. Ukraine's new form of warfare has cornered him into a paradox. To defend his empire, he must weaken it. To appear strong, he must reveal his fear. The drones have done more than pierce Moscow's sky, they have pierced the illusion of permanence. And that illusion was the true armor of his regime. As the lights of the capital flicker each night with the sound of air raid sirens, one question haunts the Kremlin halls. Is this how empires end, not with invasion, but with the echo of their own fear?